At a corporate party, I reached out to hug my wife, and she pushed me away so hard that my drink nearly hit the floor. "Don't touch me," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. That moment wasn't just embarrassing. It was the exact second I realized my marriage had been dead for months, and I was the only one who didn't know it. My name is Daniel Wright, and this is the story of how one sentence at a party unraveled 12 years of my life and exposed a conspiracy that involved my wife, her family, and a man I thought was just her coworker. The room went silent after she said those words, the kind of silence that feels like everyone's holding their breath at once. I stood there with my hands still half raised, frozen like an idiot, while my wife Emily turned back to her conversation circle as if nothing had happened. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself, it was the fact that nobody seemed surprised. A few people glanced away quickly, some suddenly found their phones very interesting, and one guy I barely knew gave me this look of pity that made my stomach turn. That's when I noticed Lucas Hale standing next to Emily, closer than any coworker should be, with his hand resting casually on the small of her back. Lucas worked in her department, some senior analyst position that apparently required him to be at every single company event Emily attended. I'd met him a handful of times over the past year, always got the same polite smile and firm handshake. The kind of guy who seems perfectly harmless until you realize he's been playing chess while you're still figuring out the rules. He wasn't laughing or smirking. He just stood there with this calm, almost bored expression, like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. Emily was wearing the dress I'd complimented that morning, the navy one with the silver details that she said made her feel confident. She'd spent an hour getting ready, which wasn't unusual, but now I was replaying every detail in my head with this sick new clarity. She hadn't asked me how I looked, hadn't really spoken to me in the car ride over, and when we walked into the venue she'd immediately drifted toward Lucas and his group. I told myself she was just networking, being professional, doing the whole career woman thing that I'd always supported. But standing there with my drink getting warm in my hand, and everyone pretending they hadn't just witnessed my humiliation, I felt like the biggest fool in the room. Emily's sister Hannah appeared at my elbow a few minutes later, her voice low and careful. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, and I could tell from her tone that she'd seen everything. Hannah was the only one in Emily's family who'd ever treated me like an actual person instead of some accessory to her sister's perfect life, so I gave her an honest answer instead of the polite lie I'd been preparing. "Bad night?" she said, trying to soften it, trying to give me an out. I looked at her directly and said something I didn't even know I was thinking until it came out of my mouth. "No, the last one." Hannah's face changed then, this flicker of something that might have been relief or maybe guilt. I couldn't tell which. She nodded slowly and squeezed my arm before disappearing back into the crowd, and I was left standing there with the distinct feeling that I'd just crossed some invisible line. The party dragged on for another hour, during which Emily didn't look at me once. I watched her laugh at Lucas's jokes, saw her lean in when he whispered something, noticed the way her whole body language shifted when he was around, open and animated in a way she hadn't been with me in years. By the time we left, I'd made a decision, though I couldn't have told you exactly what it was yet. The drive home was completely silent, not even the radio playing because Emily had turned it off the second we got in the car. She stared out the passenger window the entire time, her jaw tight, her hands folded in her lap, like she was physically restraining herself from saying something. When we got to the house, she went straight to the bathroom and locked the door, which was bizarre because in 12 years of marriage, she'd never once locked that door. I stood in the hallway for a second, listening to the water run, and felt this cold certainty settle over me that something fundamental had broken tonight and wasn't getting fixed. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a whiskey I didn't really want, and noticed Emily's purse sitting on the counter where she dropped it. I'm not the kind of person who goes through other people's things, never have been, always believed that trust was more important than proof. But my hand was reaching for that purse before I'd even made a conscious choice, and when I opened it, I found a second phone. A cheap prepaid thing that definitely wasn't the iPhone she carried everywhere. My hands were shaking when I turned it on, and the first message I saw made my blood go cold. "Tomorrow night, room 519, can't wait." The text was from Lucas, sent earlier that day. I scrolled up and found months of messages, hotel confirmations, inside jokes about me, discussions about their future together, conversations about how much longer Emily needed to keep up appearances before she could leave. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and sat down at the kitchen table with my whiskey, my mind racing through every conversation, every late night at the office, every weekend business trip that had seemed so reasonable at the time. Emily came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later in her pajamas, her makeup scrubbed off, looking tired and small in a way that might have made me feel sorry for her if I hadn't just read those messages. She didn't say goodnight, just walked past me like I was furniture and went upstairs to the bedroom. I stayed at that table until 3 in the morning, not drinking, not moving, just sitting there in the dark and realizing that the worst part wasn't the cheating itself. The worst part was how easy she thought this would be, how completely she believed I'd never look deeper, never question, never fight back. She'd built this entire second life right under my nose and hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks properly, because she was that confident I'd never notice. I thought about that moment at the party, the way she'd said those words with such casual cruelty, and understood that it hadn't been spontaneous. It had been a message, a public declaration that I didn't matter anymore, that whatever we'd had was over and she wasn't even trying to hide it. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I'd already started planning my next move. I didn't know all the details yet, didn't have the full picture, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to be the fool in this story anymore. I still didn't know exactly who was involved or how deep this went, but I could feel it, this sense that I was standing alone in a room where everyone else already knew the ending. That feeling, more than anything else, told me this was bigger than just Emily and Lucas, bigger than a simple affair, and I was about to find out just how wrong I'd been about everything. I barely slept 3 hours before calling Emily's sister Hannah late the next morning, asking her to meet me for coffee. I kept it casual, just said I needed to talk about something important, and she agreed immediately, too immediately, like she'd been expecting this call. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where nobody from Emily's social circle would accidentally run into us, and Hannah looked nervous the second she sat down. She ordered a latte she didn't drink, kept fidgeting with the sleeve on her cup, and wouldn't make eye contact for the first few minutes. I didn't push, just let the silence stretch until she couldn't take it anymore. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and guilty. "Lucas influences Emily more than you think," she said, and the way she said it, like she was confessing something she'd been holding onto for months, made my chest tighten. I asked her what she meant by that, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was pounding, and she looked at me with this expression that was half pity and half relief. She didn't give me details, wouldn't say exactly what she knew, but the way she kept apologizing and saying she should have told me sooner made it clear this wasn't news to her. Hannah had known, maybe not everything, but enough, and she'd stayed quiet while I walked around like an idiot thinking my marriage was just going through a rough patch. When I left that cafe, I felt sick, not because of what Hannah had said, but because of what she hadn't said, all those careful pauses and loaded glances that told me this went deeper than one affair. I was halfway home when my phone rang and Emily's mother Margaret's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer because talking to Margaret was usually an exercise in being lectured about my shortcomings. But something made me pick up, maybe curiosity, maybe just the need to know how bad this really was. Her voice was cold and rehearsed, like she'd practiced exactly what she was going to say, and within 30 seconds I understood that this call wasn't random. "You're holding her back," Margaret said, no greeting, no pretense of concern, just straight into the attack. She went on about how Emily needed space to grow, how I was making things harder than they needed to be, how a real husband would understand when it was time to step aside. The whole speech had this weird quality, like she was reading from a script someone else had written, and I realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't a concerned mother calling to check on her daughter's marriage. This was damage control, someone trying to get ahead of a story they knew was about to break. Margaret had never liked me. That was nothing new. But this was different. This was coordinated. She was talking to me like the decision had already been made, like my role in this entire situation was just to sign whatever papers they put in front of me and disappear quietly. I hung up on her mid-sentence, something I'd never done before, and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to process what was happening. When I got home, Emily was at work, or at least that's where she said she was going, and I went straight to her office where she kept all her personal documents. The second phone was gone from her purse. She'd obviously realized I might look, but people who are hiding things always make mistakes, and Emily was no exception. I found a tablet she rarely used shoved in the back of her desk drawer, and when I turned it on, it was still logged into her email. There were messages from Lucas, casual and familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, talking about dinner plans and weekend trips and inside jokes that clearly went back months. But what caught my attention was a message from 3 weeks ago with the subject line, "Next Steps." And when I opened it, my entire world shifted. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning my exit, discussing how to position me as unstable, how to make sure Emily got the house and most of our assets, even talking about witnesses who could testify to my supposed erratic behavior. Hannah's name was in that email, along with a question about whether she'd be willing to make a statement if it came to that. I took photos of everything with my own phone, my hands steady even though I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. And then I put the tablet back exactly where I'd found it. That's when I decided to call a private investigator, not because I needed more proof for myself, but because I needed documentation that would hold up if this turned into a legal battle. I found Victor Reynolds through a lawyer friend who owed me a favor, and when we met the next day, Victor listened to my story without interrupting once. He was in his 50s, calm and professional, the kind of guy who'd seen every variation of human betrayal and wasn't impressed by any of it anymore. "If this is real, it won't take long," he said, and something about his confidence made me feel less crazy, like maybe I wasn't overreacting or imagining conspiracies where none existed. Victor worked fast, came back to me within 2 weeks with a folder so thick I needed both hands to carry it. There were photos of Emily and Lucas at restaurants, hotels, his apartment, her car parked outside his building overnight. There were credit card statements showing charges at expensive hotels on nights Emily had told me she was at business conferences. There were phone records with hundreds of calls and texts between them going back almost a year. There were even bank transfers, Emily moving money from our joint account into a separate one I didn't know existed, small amounts at first, but getting bigger over time. Victor had timeline charts, location data, witness statements from hotel staff who recognized them as regulars. They hadn't been careful, hadn't really tried to hide anything, because they genuinely didn't think I was enough of a threat to bother covering their tracks properly. The worst part came when Victor showed me the last piece of evidence, a recording he'd gotten from a source he wouldn't name. It was Emily and Lucas in his car, parked somewhere private, talking about the divorce they were planning. Emily's voice was different, lighter and more animated than I'd heard it in years, talking about how easy it would be to paint me as controlling and jealous, how her family would back her up completely, how I'd probably just accept whatever settlement they offered because I always took the path of least resistance. Lucas was encouraging her, making jokes about how I'd looked at the party when she pushed me away, calling me pathetic in that casual way that told me this wasn't the first time they'd discussed me like this. I listened to the whole thing sitting in Victor's office, my face probably blank because I'd run out of emotional reactions somewhere around the hotel photos. When it was over, Victor asked me what I wanted to do next, and I told him to keep digging, find everything. Because if they thought I was going to roll over and make this easy, they'd seriously miscalculated who they were dealing with. That night, Hannah called me, her voice shaking, and said something that confirmed what I already suspected. "They asked me to testify against you," she said, and I could hear her crying on the other end of the line. She said Emily had called her that afternoon, casual and friendly, working the conversation around to asking if Hannah would be willing to tell a lawyer about times I'd seemed angry or unreasonable or difficult to deal with. Hannah had refused, which was why she was calling me now, guilt and panic making her words tumble out faster than I could process them. I thanked her for telling me, kept my voice gentle even though I wanted to scream, and told her not to worry about it, that I had everything under control. I didn't, not really, but saying it out loud made it feel more true. I spent the rest of that night going through Victor's folder again, organizing everything chronologically, building a picture in my mind of exactly how long this had been going on and how many people had known about it, while smiling to my face. They thought I was quiet because I was broken, too passive to fight back, too in love with Emily to see what was right in front of me. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't quiet because I'd given up. I was quiet because I was preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I needed to make sure that when I finally made my move, there wouldn't be any room for them to spin the narrative in their favor. I met with a divorce lawyer named Claire Morrison on a cold morning 2 weeks after I'd started collecting evidence, and the first thing she said when I walked into her office was that I looked tired. I told her I hadn't been sleeping much, which was true, and she nodded like she'd heard that 1,000 times before. Claire had a reputation for being ruthless in court, the kind of attorney who didn't waste time on sympathy or small talk, and when I laid out Victor's folder on her desk, she spent 40 minutes going through every page without saying a word. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was serious, but not surprised, like she'd seen this exact scenario play out with different names and faces more times than she could count. "You're not in a marriage. You're in a war," she said, and something about hearing it stated that plainly made everything feel more real. We spent the next 3 hours building a strategy, going through financial records, talking about how to protect assets and reputation when the other side was already planning to destroy both. Claire was methodical, asking questions I hadn't thought of, finding holes in my documentation that needed filling, making me realize that being right wasn't enough if I couldn't prove it in a way that would hold up under scrutiny. She told me to keep acting normal, don't let Emily know I was onto her, don't confront anyone or make accusations, just gather more evidence and wait for the right moment to file. The hardest part was going home that night and pretending everything was fine, sitting across from Emily at dinner while she talked about her day at work and I nodded in all the right places, knowing that she was probably texting Lucas the second I left the room. 2 days later, Emily came home from work early, which was unusual, and dropped a manila envelope on the kitchen table in front of me. Just sign, I've endured enough, she said, her voice tight with frustration, like I was being difficult by existing in her space. I opened the envelope and found divorce papers, already filled out, with terms that were laughably one-sided. She wanted the house, the car, most of our savings, and she'd even included a clause about me covering her legal fees. There was a paragraph about my supposed emotional instability, carefully worded to sound reasonable while painting me as someone who'd been difficult to live with for years. I read through the whole thing slowly, watching Emily's face get more impatient with every page I turned, and when I finished I set it down and told her I needed time to think about it. She looked genuinely shocked, like she'd expected me to sign immediately and thank her for making it easy. There's nothing to think about, she said, her voice getting sharper. This is what's happening, Daniel. You can either make it simple or make it ugly. I told her I'd have my lawyer look at it, keeping my voice calm and neutral, and she actually laughed at that, this bitter sound that told me she thought I was bluffing. She didn't know I'd already been working with Claire for weeks, didn't know about Victor's folder or the evidence I'd been collecting, still believed I was the same passive guy who'd let her push him away at that party without saying a word. The breaking point came 3 days later when Emily's family called a meeting at her parents' house. One of those formal sit-downs that was clearly meant to be an intervention. I showed up because refusing would have tipped my hand, and the second I walked in I could tell from everyone's faces that they'd already decided how this was going to go. Margaret sat at the head of the table like a judge. Emily's father Richard stood behind her looking uncomfortable but compliant. Hannah was there, but wouldn't meet my eyes, and Emily sat next to Lucas, which was bold even by their standards. They'd actually invited him to a family meeting about their daughter's marriage, and nobody seemed to think that was strange. Margaret started talking about how marriages sometimes run their course, how Emily deserved to be happy, how I needed to accept that this relationship had reached its natural end. Richard added something about respecting Emily's choices and not dragging things out unnecessarily. Lucas didn't say anything, but his presence said everything. This quiet confirmation that he was already part of the family and I was just a problem to be solved. I sat there listening to all of it, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions that made them think I was coming around to their way of thinking. Hannah looked miserable the entire time, kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something and then closing it again. When Margaret finally asked if I understood what they were telling me, I said yes. I understood perfectly, and I could see the relief on all their faces except Hannah's, who looked like she might cry. That night I called Claire and told her it was time to move. The next morning, before Emily even woke up, I filed for divorce with all of Victor's evidence attached. Claire had prepared everything perfectly, a comprehensive filing that included photos, bank statements, phone records, witness testimonies, and a detailed timeline of Emily's affair and the conspiracy to defraud me in the divorce. I had copies delivered to Emily at her office, to Lucas at his desk 3 floors up, to Margaret and Richard's house, even to the HR department at Emily's company, since their affair violated about 6 different workplace policies. By noon, my phone was exploding with calls and texts that I ignored, and by evening, Emily showed up at the house in a state I'd never seen her in before. She wasn't angry or defensive. She was panicking, her voice shaking as she demanded to know where I got all that information and why I was doing this to her. You didn't betray me by loving someone else. You betrayed me because you thought I'd never stand up for myself, I said, and something about finally saying it out loud made my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. She tried to argue, tried to spin it like I was overreacting or misunderstanding what the evidence showed, but there was no conviction behind her words anymore. Lucas had apparently already lawyered up and stopped returning her calls. Margaret had left 3 increasingly frantic voicemails about needing to talk immediately, and Emily's company had put both her and Lucas on administrative leave pending an investigation. Everything she'd built, This whole carefully constructed plan to exit our marriage on her terms, while making me look like the problem, had collapsed in less than 12 hours because she'd underestimated me so completely that she didn't bother covering her tracks. The divorce took 4 months to finalize, faster than usual because Emily's lawyer knew they had no defense against the evidence Claire presented. Emily tried to negotiate a few times, wanted to settle quietly and avoid a trial, but Claire advised me to let it go to court, and I'm glad I listened. The judge was not sympathetic to someone who'd planned to commit fraud while conducting an affair with a coworker, and the final settlement was about as fair as these things ever get. I kept the house. We split the savings equally after Emily paid back what she'd moved into her secret account, and she ended up covering most of her own legal fees. Lucas got fired after the company investigation confirmed multiple policy violations, and last I heard he and Emily weren't together anymore. Apparently, relationships built on deception don't hold up well under pressure. Margaret stopped calling after the settlement was finalized, which was honestly a relief, and Hannah reached out a few months later to apologize again. I told her I understood she'd been in an impossible position, which was mostly true, and we still talk occasionally, though things will probably never be quite the same. I moved into a smaller apartment downtown 6 months after the divorce was final, one of those modern places with big windows and hardwood floors that doesn't have any memories attached to it. I make tea in the mornings and sit by the window watching the city wake up, and sometimes I think about that night at the party when Emily pushed me away and how completely different my life is now. I didn't win exactly. Winning would mean none of this ever happened, but I stopped losing myself in the process of trying to save something that was already gone. Some mornings I still feel angry about the time I wasted, the lies I believed, the way an entire family conspired to make me doubt my own reality. But most days I just feel quiet. The good kind of quiet that comes from knowing exactly who you are and not apologizing for it anymore. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.